The morning the donkeys came was a Tuesday in early October, 2011. I remember the air had that particular autumn clarity, sharp and smelling of distant leaf smoke and cold iron. The sky was the color of a washed-out piece of denim, and a low fog was settled in the hollows, meaning the ground still held a little of summer's warmth. The truck that brought them was a long, rattling stock trailer pulled by a Ford F-350 that had seen too many miles and not enough maintenance. The driver, a man I knew only from the regional livestock auction, looked tired. He looked like he'd been driving all night to get rid of a problem. And in a way he had. 40 of them. 40 donkeys, mostly jacks with a few jennies mixed in, stood crowded together in the trailer, their long ears twitching at the sound of my boots on the gravel drive. They weren't much to look at. A motley collection of grays, browns, and a few spotted ones, all on the small side, with burrs tangled in their manes and a look of profound indifference in their dark eyes. They were the animals nobody wanted, the ones that had been run through the sale ring 3 times with the auctioneer's price dropping each time until it was nearly a joke. Lot of 40, sound of wind and limb, sold as a lot, he chanted, his voice losing enthusiasm. I'd raised my hand on the third call, when the price was down to $20 a head. $800 for 40 head of anything felt less like a purchase and more like a dare. The driver unlatched the trailer gate with a groan of rusty metal. "They're all yours," he said, not making eye contact. He just wanted them off his truck. "You sure you want M on this piece?" He gestured with his chin toward the back 40, the section of my property that ran up against the ridge. It was the poorest part of the farm, a stretch of ground my father had always called the hard pan. It was mostly clay, rock, and stubborn weeds, with a few scraggly cedars clinging to the slopes. It wasn't good for cattle, it wasn't good for crops. It was just there, 40 acres of marginal land that I'd never quite figured out what to do with. I told him I was sure. The donkeys began to trickle out, hesitant at first, then in a dusty clump. They didn't bolt or run. They just stepped onto the grass, took a look around as if unimpressed by the whole affair, and began to graze on the sparse autumn vegetation along the fence line. They moved slowly, deliberately, as a single unit. Just then, a familiar sound came up the road. It was my neighbor, Dale, in his new GMC truck. It was always clean, the kind of truck a man buys when he's done more managing than working. He pulled up and idled by the fence, rolling down his window with a soft electronic whir. He looked at the donkeys, then at me, then back at the donkeys. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Morning," he said. "Restocking." I said I was. "Donkeys," he stated. It wasn't a question. 40 of them, I confirmed. He leaned his arm on the windowsill. "Auction animals?" I nodded. He knew they were. He'd probably been there. "Heard they couldn't give those away," he said, his voice level and polite, which was always worse than open mockery. "Figured I'd take 'em," I said. He looked out over the hardpan pasture, the donkeys already spreading out in a loose, shambling line. "Putting 'em on the hardpan, I see. What are you figuring on, grazing?" "There's not enough forage back there to keep a grasshopper alive through winter." I told him I had my reasons. This was the part of the conversation I knew was coming. The part where a man has to defend a decision that doesn't make sense on a spreadsheet. "They're browsers," I said. "They'll eat the weeds, the brush. Clean it up some." Dale just nodded slowly, his eyes saying what his mouth was too polite to. He was thinking I was a sentimental old fool, taking in cast-offs and putting them on my worst piece of land out of some misguided sense of charity. By noon, I knew the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was starting a donkey rescue. I was going broke. I was losing my mind. The story was probably more interesting than the truth. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself what I was doing. It was a hunch, a whisper of a memory from my father. But I hadn't yet looked in the notebook. I hadn't confirmed the one thing that might make this whole venture either the smartest or the dumbest thing I'd ever done. I just watched the donkeys. They ignored me, ignored the clean truck driving away, ignored the world. They moved with a slow, geological patience, their heads down, reading the ground in a language I didn't speak. I didn't know it yet, but they already knew more about that piece of land than I did. They knew something was there, and I had a feeling it had been waiting a long, long time. The following week, the extension agent came out. His name was Kevin, a young man in his late 20s with a degree in agronomy from the state university. He wore a brand new pair of Carhartts that were still stiff and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his hand. Dale had probably called him, figuring he was doing me a favor, trying to save me from myself. Kevin was all earnestness and data. He'd already pulled up the soil maps for my property on his tablet. He walked the fence line of the back 40 with me, the donkeys watching us from a distance with what looked like mild contempt. So, Kevin began, clicking his pen. The stocking rate on this pasture is, to be generous, extremely low. We're looking at a soil composition that's over 60% clay, with significant rock outcroppings. Forage analysis from this county suggests the dominant species are broomsage and thistle, which have very low nutritional value. He looked up from his clipboard, his expression one of sincere concern. Honestly, 40 head of anything on this parcel is unsustainable. Even for browsers like donkeys. You'll have them eating the bark off those cedars by January, and you'll be looking at significant hay costs to get them through to spring. I listened. I'd heard it all before in one form or another. The numbers, the analysis, the bottom line. My father used to say that a man with a clipboard can tell you 100 ways a thing can't be done, but he can't tell you the one way it can. I appreciate you coming out, Kevin, I said. I've got a plan for supplemental feed. It's the land I'm worried about too, he went on, undeterred. Without proper rotation, they'll compact the soil, create erosion problems on the slopes. You could end up with a real mess back here. Have you considered a targeted herbicide application to control the thistle and then overseeding with a more robust forage grass like fescue? I told him I had not. I told him I wanted to see what the donkeys did first. This was the statement that seemed to baffle him. What they do? He asked, his pen pausing over the paper. They're livestock. They'll eat. They'll wander. They'll compact the ground. Their behavior is predictable based on forage availability. He pointed to a cluster of donkeys standing on a relatively flat, bare-looking patch near the center of the pasture. See? They're already congregating on one of the few level spots. That's going to be a mud hole by spring. I looked where he was pointing. It was the spot I'd been watching. It wasn't the only level area, not by a long shot. But it was the one they kept coming back to. I just nodded. I'll keep an eye on it, Kevin sighed. A small, frustrated puff of air. He made a few more notes, handed me a pamphlet on sustainable pasture management, and told me to call him if I changed my mind about the herbicide. He meant well. They always do. He saw a problem that could be solved with data and chemicals. He saw 40 acres of poor land and 40 useless animals. He couldn't see what I was looking for. He couldn't see the history buried under the clay. After he left, I went to the co-op for a few bags of mineral supplement. The talk stopped when I walked in. Frank, who'd been behind the counter for 30 years, just gave me a slow nod. Heard you got some new stock, he said, weighing out the bags. A few of the other farmers in the store were suddenly very interested in the seed catalogs. Just a few, I said. Donkeys are smart animals, Frank said, looking at me over the top of his glasses. Smarter than people think. Stubborn, maybe, but they pay attention. It was the closest thing to encouragement I'd gotten all week. My wife, Martha, was more direct. That evening, as I was looking out the kitchen window at the back 40, she came and stood beside me. She'd been my partner in this life for nearly 50 years. She'd seen me through droughts, floods, and crashing market prices. She trusted me, but she was not a woman who dealt in sentiment. 40 donkeys, huh? She said. I nodded. Dale says you're trying to save their souls. Dale has a new truck to pay for. He's got to talk about something. She was quiet for a minute, watching the last of the evening light catch the ridge. How much are they going to cost us in feed this winter? It was the real question, the practical one. I told her the number I'd calculated. She didn't flinch. All right, she said. But if they eat the siding off the barn, they're Dale's problem, I smiled. That was her way of giving her blessing. But her question, and Kevin's visit had put a fine point on it. I was operating on a ghost of a memory, a feeling. It was time to see if there was anything more to it than that. I was being doubted by my neighbors, questioned by the experts, and tolerated by my wife. It's a lonely place to be, but it's also the place where you find out if you're right. That night, after Martha was asleep, I didn't go to the barn. I didn't go looking for the notebook. I told myself I'd do it in the morning. I put it off. I'll own that. I was afraid of what I might not find. I was afraid that Dale and Kevin and all the data were right, and I was just an old man chasing a ghost on 40 acres of useless ground with 40 useless animals. The reason I bought the donkeys, the real reason, had nothing to do with saving them and everything to do with my father. He died in the winter of '98, but I still heard his voice clear as a bell, especially when I was walking the land. He was a quiet man, not given to grand statements, but what he said, he'd earned the right to say. He'd farmed this same ground his whole life, and he believed the land would tell you its secrets, but only if you knew how to listen. And he believed animals were the best listeners of all. One of his favorite sayings was, "The hardest ground holds the oldest secrets." He didn't like things that were too easy. He was suspicious of a field that drained perfectly or soil that was black and rich from fence to fence. He'd say, "Anybody can farm the easy ground. The test of a man is what he does with the trouble spots." That back 40 was our biggest trouble spot. I remember being a boy, maybe 10 years old, walking it with him. I'd complained about the rocks and the hard, cracked clay that was slick as grease after a rain and like concrete in a drought. He'd stopped and picked up a piece of reddish, crumbly stone. "This ground has been through a lot," he'd said, turning the stone over in his calloused palm. "Glaciers scraped it, forests burned on it, and men have tried to break it for 200 years. It doesn't give up easy. You have to pay attention to a piece of ground like this." We were standing on that same flat shelf of land where the donkeys now spent most of their time. I remember him pointing with his chin. "See how nothing much grows right here? Just some poverty grass and that tough little plantain." I nodded. Most people would plow it under, throw lime and fertilizer at it until it submitted. But they'd be fighting the ground. They wouldn't be listening to it. He crumbled the stone in his fingers, letting the red dust fall. "Always watch the animals on a trouble spot," he told me. "A cow will find the sweetest grass. A hog will find the coolest mud. But a stubborn animal, a goat or a mule, they'll find the thing that's different. They'll find the medicine." He believed that animals, especially those that hadn't been overbred for docility, retained an instinct for seeking out minerals or soil compositions that they needed. He called it finding their medicine. He'd point out how the deer would lick at a particular clay bank, or how the wild turkeys would dust themselves in one specific spot and no other. He saw it not as random behavior, but as a map, a guide to what was under the surface. This particular spot on the hardpan had always bothered him. It was an anomaly. It was a patch of about half an acre, maybe a little more, that was unnaturally flat in a rolling pasture. The soil was different, too. Paler, denser. In the heat of summer, you could see the heat shimmering off it differently than the surrounding ground. And after a hard summer rain, when the air was thick and humid, he swore he could smell something. A faint, smoky, almost savory smell rising from the earth. I was a kid, so I thought he was just telling stories. But he was serious. "Something was here," he'd say, staring at that patch of ground. "Something that cooked or cured or burned for a long, long time. Changed the soil. Before men were here, even, he never did anything about it." He was a man of his time. Farming was a business of acres and bushels, and there was no profit in digging up a pasture because of a smell. He had fences to mend and debts to pay. But he never stopped watching it. And he taught me to watch it, too. So when I saw those donkeys at the auction, looking stubborn and overlooked, something clicked. My father always had a soft spot for mules, the original stubborn animal. He respected their intelligence, which he said people mistook for obstinacy. He'd say a horse will walk off a cliff if you ask it to, but a mule will stop and make you think about it. I saw those donkeys and I thought of my father and I thought of that patch of ground. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a half-forgotten conversation from 40 years ago. But the auctioneer was calling for the last time, and I saw a chance to finally listen to that piece of ground in the way my father always said you should. I was buying 40 soil experts, 40 dowsing rods with long ears and an innate sense for the peculiar. I was betting $800 that my father was right, that the hardest ground holds the oldest secrets, and that a stubborn animal will show you where to dig. It was a bet on his wisdom against all the modern logic of stocking rates and forage analysis. And as I stood there, watching those donkeys stand resolutely on that pale patch of earth, ignoring the greener bits of pasture just yards away, I felt a deep sense of purpose settle over me. They weren't just standing there. They were telling me something. They were paying attention. And now, finally, so was I. 2 days after the extension agent's visit, on a Thursday night when the wind was rattling the windows, I decided it was time. I couldn't put it off any longer. I finished my coffee, told Martha I was going out to the workshop for a bit, and pulled on my boots. The workshop is in the old part of the barn, the section built by my grandfather in the 1930s. It smells of old wood, motor oil, and dust. It's where the things that are too useful to throw away but not useful enough for every day end up. Tucked away on a high shelf, inside a dusty wooden crate filled with old tractor manuals and seed catalogs from the 1970s, was what I was looking for. It was a stack of my father's old notebooks. He wasn't a diary keeper, but he was a meticulous record keeper. There were marbled composition books filled with notes on planting dates, rainfall, and calving records. But the one I wanted was different. It was a thin, softcover ledger, the kind a small business might have used a lifetime ago. The cover was a faded green, and the corners were soft and rounded from years of being carried in a coat pocket or the glove box of a pickup. I took it down from the shelf. The crate it was in was full of the detritus of a farming life. An old oil can, a set of spark plug gauges, a wooden-handled screwdriver with his initials, TH, burned into the handle. Holding the notebook, I could almost feel the weight of his hands on it. I brought it back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table under the single bright light. Martha was reading in the living room. The house was quiet except for the wind and the ticking of the clock. I opened the ledger. The pages were filled with his neat, slightly slanted handwriting, done in pencil that had faded to a soft gray. The entries were terse, factual. May 1st, 1958. Corn in the south field. Soil dry. Rain needed. October 12, 1961. First frost. 28 degrees at 6 a.m. Pulled the last of the tomatoes. March 20th, 1965. Sold 10 steers. 24 cents a pound. Market is soft. I spent the better part of an hour turning the pages, reading the small, condensed history of this farm, of my own life measured out in harvests and heartaches. It was a conversation with a ghost. Then, I found the page I was looking for. I knew it the moment I saw it. It wasn't an entry. It was a sketch, a rough, hand-drawn map of the back 40. He'd traced the fence lines, the creek bed, the stand of cedars on the ridge. And there, in the middle, was a circle drawn with a slightly heavier pencil line. Inside the circle, he'd written a few words. The pencil was faint, but I could make it out under the light. Cured hams 1880s? That was the first line. A question. A piece of local lore, maybe something an old-timer had told him once. Then, underneath it, another line. Smoke smell after rain. Hot ground in July. This confirmed what I remembered him saying. He'd been documenting it, testing his own senses against the land. But it was the last line, underlined twice, that made the breath catch in my throat. It was just 2 words. Never dug, never dug. He had known or suspected for 50 years. He'd watched it, smelled it, felt its heat through the soles of his boots. He'd triangulated it with old stories. He'd marked it on a map. But he had never taken a shovel to it. He never broke the surface. Why? Because there was always something more pressing. Always a tractor to fix, a roof to patch, a loan to pay. Or maybe he knew that some mysteries are more powerful left unsolved. Maybe he wanted to leave it for someone else. For me. He had left a key in a lock, and I was the first person to come along who had the time, the inclination, and the 40 long-eared partners to try and turn it. I sat there for a long time, just looking at that page. The simple map, the cryptic notes, the underlined finality of those two words. It wasn't a hunch anymore. It was a legacy. A treasure map where X marked a spot that smelled like smoke after a rain. The donkeys weren't just congregating randomly on a patch of bare ground. They were standing right inside that hand-drawn circle. They were pawing at the ground, their hooves scuffing the pale clay, right over the question mark my father had left behind. They were doing what he never did. They were digging. The next morning, I was out before sunrise. The air was cold and damp. I walked to the back 40 carrying a soil probe. The donkeys watched me approach, their ears swiveling in unison. They were all there, all 40 of them, standing on the spot. I walked to the edge of the circle and pushed the probe into the ground. It went in about 8 inches, then stopped with a familiar, solid thud. Claypan. Just as the soil map said. I moved 10 feet away outside the area and tried again. The probe sank in 2 feet, easy, into the richer, darker soil of the main pasture. I went back to the edge of the circle of donkeys. I walked right into the middle of them. They shifted slightly to let me pass, but they didn't move off. They watched me, their breath pluming in the cold air. I found the very center of the bare patch, the place where they seemed to paw the most. I set my feet, put my weight on the handles of the probe, and pushed. It slid through the first few inches of dry topsoil, then the dense clay. 10 inches, it hit something. But it wasn't the dull, unyielding stop of rock or hardpan. It was a gritty, scraping sound. A sound of resistance, but a different kind. I pulled the probe up. The tip was coated in the pale clay, but mixed in with it were black flecks. I rubbed it between my fingers. Felt like charcoal, but finer, like ash. And clinging to the metal was a smell. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the smell of old smoke and cured meat. The smell my father had written about. It was the smell of a secret that had been kept by the earth for more than 100 years. The next 3 weeks passed slowly. I fell into a routine. Every morning, I'd walk the back 40. Every morning, the donkeys would be on that spot. I watched them. They weren't just standing. They were working the ground. Their sharp little hooves were like dozens of tiny cultivators, chipping and scuffing away the hard surface layer of clay. After a light rain, they would become more active, pawing at the softened earth, sometimes digging down an inch or two. They were obsessed with the place. I continued my own, more methodical investigation. I bought a dozen wooden stakes and a ball of twine and laid out a 10-foot grid over the entire half-acre area. At the center of each square, I used the soil probe. The results were consistent. Outside of a roughly rectangular area, about 30 feet by 50 feet, the probe would sink deep into the soil. Inside that rectangle, it would hit the same gritty, scraping resistance at a depth of 10 to 12 inches. And every time I pulled it up from within the rectangle, it brought up that same mix of pale clay and black, ashy particles. It smelled of smoke. I took a sample of the soil from the center of the area and put it in a glass jar. I took another sample from 20 yards away and did the same. Side by side on the kitchen windowsill, the difference was stark. One was the color of coffee grounds, dark and rich. The other was pale, almost gray, and shot through with that fine black dust. Martha looked at the jars. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "The reason I bought the donkeys," I told her. I showed her the notebook. She read the page with the map, her finger tracing the circle. She looked from the notebook to the jars, then out the window toward the back pasture where the donkeys stood like small gray statues. "Theodore Henry," she said, using my father's full name. He never did like to leave a puzzle unsolved. She was in. I knew I was on to something, but I also knew I was at the edge of my own knowledge. I could probe the soil, but I couldn't read its history. I was a farmer, not an archaeologist. I needed an expert. Not the kind with a clipboard and stocking rate charts, but the other kind. The quiet kind. I thought about it for a day, then made a call. I called the local community college and asked for the history department. I ended up talking to a woman who told me the man I needed to speak to was Dr. Alistair Finch. He'd been the head of the department for 30 years but was now semi-retired. He still took calls, she said, if the subject was interesting enough. She gave me his home number. I called him that afternoon. I felt a little foolish, like a man calling a doctor to report a ghost. I explained who I was, where my farm was, and what I thought I had found. I told him about my father's notebook and the donkeys. I expected him to be politely dismissive. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment. A persistent thermal anomaly in the soil, you say? With associated olfactory phenomena after rain, he said, his voice dry and precise. And elevated charcoal particulate? I just said yes, that sounded about right. And this is on the old Henderson tract, you said? North of the creek. I confirmed it was. I'll be there Saturday morning, he said. 7 o'clock. Don't do any more digging. He arrived precisely at 7 in a Subaru that had seen as many back roads as my truck. He was a small, wiry man in his 70s, with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. He wore hiking boots, canvas pants, and a faded flannel shirt. He carried a small, worn leather satchel. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Show me the spot," he said. We walked to the back 40. The donkeys, as usual, were on station. Finch stopped at the fence line and just watched them for a full minute. He wasn't looking at them as livestock. He was looking at them as part of the landscape, as indicators. "Donkeys," he said, more to himself than to me. "Interesting. They're particular. They have a high mineral requirement." We walked into the pasture. The animals parted for us, then reformed their circle around the spot. Finch walked right to the center of my string grid. He knelt down, ignoring the damp ground, and took a handful of the pale soil. He crumbled it, smelled it, and looked at it with a small magnifying glass he produced from his satchel. "Ash," he confirmed. "Wood ash, and lots of it. Hasn't just been mixed in. It's altered the pH and the structure of the clay itself over a very long time." I showed him my soil probe. He took it, found the center of the rectangle, and pushed it down himself. He felt the scrape, the resistance. He pulled it up and examined the tip. He did this 3 more times at different points within the rectangle, his movements economical and precise. Then I showed him my father's notebook. He sat on the ground right there in the middle of the pasture and read the page with the map. He traced the circle with his finger, just as Martha had. He read the words aloud, softly. "Cured hams 1880s? Smoke smell after rain." Never dug, he closed the book and handed it back to me carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact itself. He stood up and looked around, not at the ground, but at the lay of the land, the slope, the access to the old road trace, the distance to the creek. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. I just waited. Finally, he looked at me. His eyes were bright, lit with a kind of intellectual fire. "Your father was a very observant man," he said. "And his timeline is probably conservative." He paused, taking another look at the donkeys who were watching us patiently. "What you have here is not a farm feature. The scale, the concentration of ash. This is industrial, or proto-industrial, for its time." He kicked lightly at the ground with the heel of his boot. "Before refrigeration, the only way to preserve meat on a commercial scale was salting and smoking. A big operation, one that supplied logging camps or railroad crews, would have a dedicated smokehouse. A large one, and they'd run the fires for months on end, year after year. The ground underneath would be baked, sterilized, and saturated with ash and creosote." He looked at me, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, tight smile of pure academic delight. "I think your donkeys have found you a 19th century commercial smokehouse." He paused again, his gaze turning back to the ground. "And if the foundation is intact," he said softly, "there's no telling what might be inside it." The word he used wasn't exceptional or substantial, but the weight of his quiet, professional certainty was more powerful than any loud proclamation. He had taken my family folklore, my father's cryptic note, the donkey's strange obsession, and my own amateur probing, and he had woven it all into a coherent, credible story. A story that was waiting just 10 inches under our feet. The dig began the following Tuesday. Finch had arranged for 2 of his graduate students, a young man and woman who were as enthusiastic as he was, to help. It wasn't a backhoe operation. It was a careful archaeological dig. We used shovels to remove the top layer of compacted soil and clay, the part the donkeys had already started to break up for us. Once we were down about 8 inches, we switched to hand trowels. The work was slow, methodical. My job was mostly hauling away the excavated dirt in a wheelbarrow. The donkeys watched from a respectful distance, as if supervising the work they had started. By mid-morning, we hit the first stone. It was a large, flat piece of fieldstone, dark with age, its top surface sitting exactly 10 inches below the pasture. The student, Sarah, called out, and Finch came over immediately. He knelt and brushed the dirt away from it with a soft brush. Then another stone was uncovered next to it, perfectly fitted. And another. Within an hour, we had exposed the top course of a dry-laid stone foundation. It was unmistakable. The rectangle I had mapped with my soil probe was the exact outline of the building. It was, as Finch had predicted, about 30 feet by 50 feet. The stonework was beautiful, the work of a craftsman who knew how to fit irregular shapes into a solid, enduring wall. My father's underlined words echoed in my head. Never dug. All this time it had been right here, waiting. The real excitement started in the afternoon. As we cleared the soil from the interior of the foundation, we began to find things. The first was a shower of rusty, square-cut nails. Then, pieces of charcoal, not the fine ash that had saturated the soil, but larger chunks, some with the grain of the original wood still visible. Finch identified it as hickory and apple wood, the best woods for smoking meat. We found the hook, a heavy, S-shaped piece of forged iron, the kind that would have been used to hang a ham or a side of bacon from the rafters. It was pitted with rust but still solid. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my hand, a direct physical link to the past, to the men who had worked in this smoky, fragrant darkness more than a century ago. Then Sarah made the discovery of the day. She was working in a corner of the foundation, carefully scraping away layers of soil and ash, when her trowel made a dull clinking sound. Not the sound of hitting stone, but something else. She brushed the dirt away and uncovered the curved, salt-glazed shoulder of a large stoneware crock. It was intact. It took them another hour to excavate it fully. It was a 5-gallon crock, the kind used for salting and curing. The lid was still in place, sealed with a hard, dark wax that had long since petrified. It was incredibly heavy. It took 2 of us to lift it out of the excavation pit. There was something inside. We could hear a soft, shifting sound when we moved it. Finch was ecstatic, in his quiet, understated way. "This is remarkable," he said, running his hand over the cool ceramic surface. "To find a sealed vessel in a context like this. It's a time capsule." By the end of the day, we had uncovered 3 more crocks, all sealed, along with a trove of smaller artifacts. Broken clay pipes, the leather sole of a work boot, a collection of patent medicine bottles. The foundation itself was a marvel. In the center, we found the remains of the fire pits, the earth baked to the hardness and color of brick. The building had likely burned down or been dismantled, and the foundation had simply filled with dirt and time, a shallow grave for a forgotten enterprise. The smokehouse was real. My father's hunch, the smell after the rain, the hot ground in July, it was all real. The donkeys hadn't been stubborn. They'd been drawn to the unique mineral signature of the ash-saturated soil, the medicine my father had talked about. They had led me right to it. That evening, as the sun was setting, Dale drove by again. He slowed his clean GMC to a stop at the fence line, just as he had the day the donkeys arrived. He looked at the pile of excavated earth, the neat rectangle of the uncovered foundation, the small group of us cleaning our tools. He didn't get out. He just rolled down his window. He looked at me for a long moment. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to reconcile the sight before him with his initial assessment of my foolishness. "Looks like your jackasses found something besides trouble," he said. It was as close to an apology or an admission of being wrong as I was ever going to get from him. I just nodded. "They pay attention," I said. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. Then he rolled up his window and drove on, leaving a small cloud of dust hanging in the evening air. The vindication wasn't loud. It wasn't a triumphant celebration. It was quiet. It was the weight of the iron hook in my hand. It was the sight of the old stone walls emerging from the earth. It was the grudging respect in my neighbor's voice. And most of all, it was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my father's wisdom, passed down through a cryptic note and a lifetime of observation, had been true. The hardest ground really did hold the oldest secrets. You just needed the right key to unlock it. And sometimes the key has long ears and a stubborn disposition. The story of the Smokehouse became a small local sensation. Dr. Finch and his students spent the next several weeks carefully documenting and excavating the site. The sealed crocks, when finally opened in a lab at the college, contained perfectly preserved pickled pork, packed in brine over 130 years ago. It was a significant find, a tangible piece of the region's economic history that had been completely lost to memory. The college issued a press release. A reporter from the county paper came out and took a picture of me standing with Dr. Finch by the foundation, the donkeys photobombing us in the background. The headline read, "Local farmers' donkeys unearth historic smokeworks." Suddenly, I wasn't the old fool who'd overpaid for useless auction animals. I was the canny farmer who listened to the land. Dale even stopped by one afternoon with a six-pack of beer, which for him was the equivalent of a formal written apology. We stood by the fence and looked at the excavation. "Never would have figured," he said, shaking his head. "Right under our noses the whole time." I told him he was right about one thing. The donkeys had cost me a fair bit in hay that winter. He just laughed. But for me, the real meaning of it all settled in more slowly. It settled in during the quiet moments, long after the reporters and the students had gone home. It came to me when I'd walk the back 40 in the early morning, the donkeys trailing behind me like a loyal entourage. They still favored the area around the foundation, but their obsession had eased. Their work was done. They had delivered their message. I'd stand on the edge of the stone walls and think about my father. He could have dug. He had the same information I did, the same hunch. But he didn't, and I finally understood why. He had left it for me. It was a gift, a lesson deferred. He had taught me to watch, to listen, to be patient, and then he left me the ultimate test of those lessons. It wasn't about finding treasure or being proven right. It was about completing a circle. It was about honoring the quiet wisdom that is passed down not in textbooks, but in handwritten notes, in half-remembered conversations, in the shared experience of walking the same piece of ground across generations. The land holds memories. We think of it as dirt and rock, but it's a living ledger. It records the fires, the floods, the paths of animals, and the foundations of forgotten buildings. And it will share those memories if you ask it in the right way. You don't ask with a bulldozer or a spreadsheet. You ask with patience. You ask by watching an animal. You ask by trusting a feeling that the modern world tells you to ignore. My father used to say, "The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention for years." That back 40 was a problem. It was poor soil, a liability on the farm's balance sheet. But the donkeys didn't see a problem. They saw a solution. They saw a place that held the medicine they needed, the minerals left behind by 100 years of hickory smoke. They saw a lesson written in the earth, and by paying attention to them, I finally learned to read it. Today, the foundation is still there. Dr. Finch and the college helped us stabilize it, and we put a simple fence around it with a small sign explaining what it is. It's a permanent part of the farm's landscape now, a piece of its history brought back into the light. The donkeys are still here, too. They've grown fat and sleek. They've cleared the thistle and brush from the hardpan pasture, and better grasses have started to come in. They earned their keep and then some. They're no longer just auction rejects. They're colleagues. They're the wisest, most stubborn historians I've ever met. Every now and then, after a good rain, I'll walk out there, and if the wind is just right, I can still smell it. A faint, ghostly scent of wood smoke and time. It's a reminder that the world is full of overlooked things, forgotten stories, and hidden value. You just have to be stubborn enough to look for it, and patient enough to let the land and the animals show you where it is. If you've got your own piece of hard ground, your own stubborn animal that taught you something, or your own story of finding something the experts missed, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Thanks for listening. Subscribe if it meant something to you.